All right, welcome to this presentation. This is our first presentation of Chapter 3, Federalism. I've been teaching government for, I think, around 24, 25 years. This chapter is one of the ones that students have the most difficulty with. This is one where you really have to read carefully and be careful in terms of what you're trying to take in, because federalism to some extent is a bit of a moving target, and the meaning of federalism kind of changes to some extent as the balance of power between the federal government and state governments shift back and forth to some extent. So I'm going to give you a few seconds. I'm not going to read these to you anymore. I feel like you're capable of reading. Here are the kind of the main organizing features of the presentation of the chapter. So there you go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And here you're going to have a few seconds to look at the student learning objectives. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so what government does and why it matters. So this chapter begins with a story about a young pregnant woman who is trying to vote during the pandemic. So the county that she lived in Texas, came up with a solution for, again, one of the problems with the COVID-19 pandemic was there were lots and lots of people, in the voting, and you don't want people kind of standing around in the same places for long periods of time when there's an airborne pathogen in the air. And so the county adopted the solution of drive-through voting, where they set up places where people could go through, get a ballot, fill it out, and then submit it. And the result was that in spite of the pandemic, Texas experienced one of its higher voter turnouts in recent history. And that was a problem for the Texas state legislature, which very promptly, as soon as the 2020 elections were done, passed a law that basically banned drive-through voting. Okay, so again, this kind of highlights an important thing about federalism, right? On the one hand, you have state lawmakers, and again, in this instances, often Republicans, championing the ability of states to set their own voting rules. And yet on the other side, you've got, voter advocates who urged national legislation to protect ballot access precisely because of what happened in Texas and in Georgia and in Florida and in several other places where you saw significantly higher voter turnout, and then you saw state legislatures saying, well, we can't have that, right? And again, when you wonder why Americans turn out at lower rates than other countries, part of it is that at the state level, they have a tendency of making it more difficult to vote. Think about here in Oklahoma. Why is it that we don't allow universities to act as voting precincts, but we do allow churches? Simple question. You can ask and answer, you do your own research, figure out why you think that is the case. So again, one of the oldest questions in American government, what is the responsibility of the federal government and what are the responsibilities of the state governments? The second oldest question, when should policies be uniform across the states, and when is it better to let states and local governments adopt their own policies based on the needs and desires of their own populations? So federalism is sort of established by the Constitution. There is a difference between, a federal and a unitary system of government. In a unitary system of government, everything revolves around the central government. For example, in France, the central government in Paris basically runs everything. All the governments that exist in the provinces and elsewhere, they are simply extensions of the national government. In a federal government, you actually have what we call a compound republic, where the federal government has sovereignty over many issues, but also the states retain sovereignty of a sort. It's an truncated sovereignty. It's not absolute. The federal government ultimately does have, the supremacy of a sovereign nation, but nevertheless, the states have teeth and they can push back on national policies. So the United States was the first nation to adopt formally a federal system of government as its governing framework. The conditions that lend themselves to a federal system of government are, again, for the United States, the main thing was the states already existed, and the people that were drafting the Constitution understood that attempting to do away with the states was simply going to be a deal breaker. It would have almost certainly tanked any attempt to create a fundamentally different system of government, because the people broadly viewed themselves as Virginians and New Yorkers and Georgians, and not as Americans. That doesn't really happen until around the turn of the 19th and into the 20th century. So when you look at other countries, there are other places where you have federal systems of government. Usually it's places where you have significant ethnic or religious cleavages that are kind of geographic in nature. For example, the Netherlands, they've got kind of a Francophilic area. There are large numbers of Catholics, and then they've got large numbers of Protestants. And Catholics and Protestants don't always work and play well together, so federalism is a system that kind of works for them. Federalism creates space for accommodating diverse economic and political interests, but it can also create good and bad trouble in governing. It can, on the one hand, sort of slow things down and force compromises, but it can also kind of bollocks the work, and works and make it very difficult and fragmentary in terms of attempting to govern. The political ramifications of federalism. Federalism affects the distribution of power, but also significantly influences policy outcomes. Political or ideological preferences stemming from federalism are often not set in stone. They move from time to time, again, according to events and according to how people interpret those events. Democratic presidents sometimes make decisions about national and state responsibilities that are contrary to ideological expectations, right? Barack Obama basically gave the states more authority over their educational system than the federal law under No Child Left Behind really allowed. And then Democrats basically passed Every Child Succeeds, which was really sort of a loosening of No Child Left Behind. Another important implication of federalism relates to, again, democratic participation and governmental accountability. There are 83,000 local governments. And if you're holding constant off-year elections at the local level, people could be expected to be voting on an almost continual basis. And one of the things about Americans is many of them are not particularly interested in politics, and so their will to participate is somewhat limited. And so as much as we have these kinds of all these different kinds of school board elections and state questions and everything else going on, sometimes it's more than people are willing to tolerate. The powers of the national government, again, expressed powers are those granted to the national government in Article 1, Section 8. You also have the necessary and proper clause, which established the implied power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. You also have implied powers, which are provide the legal justification for significant expansions of the federal government over the course of the 20th century. Very important to keep in mind. Powers of the state governments. The 10th Amendment was intended to reserve to the states those powers not clearly enumerated to the federal government. There are also, the Constitution itself also clearly derogates to the state governments the power to look after the health, safety, and moral education of its citizens. Concurrent powers mean that both the federal and state governments possess the authority to take certain actions. They can both, incorporate banks. They can, they can borrow money. They can tax. Those are all very important powers. The state's police power, again, grants the states, to regulate behavior. State governments are often the first responders in times of emergency. And of course, what will often happen in a time of emergency, like, for example, when you get, significant power outages in an area of, for example, in Texas a couple of years back during the winter, Texas is, power grid is an entity unto itself, and in many instances that they simply there were too many demands on the system, and it caused power outages at a time when people not having power meant a lot of people froze to death. And so the whole point, is states can only do what they have the money to do. And so very oftentimes what will happen is the federal, the governor will declare an emergency in a given area. But if the whole state is being devastated, the president can step in and declare an emergency and get federal funds sent to that state to deal with those problems. States' obligations to one another are Article 4 of the Constitution. We talked about this in our previous discussion of the Constitution. The full faith and credit clause means that that states have to honor the contracts that are established, marriage contracts, college degrees, and whatnot that are established, in other states. There is a considerable amount of leeway in recognizing certain policies. The issue of same-sex marriage, has tended to reflect those controversies surrounding state policies regulating who can be joined in marriage. In the 1990s, the federal government passed the Defense of Marriage Act, which is known as DOMA, that basically meant that states couldn't, the states weren't obliged to honor another state's same-sex marriage contract. Ultimately, that decision was, at least for now, settled with the Supreme Court's decision in Obergefell versus Hodges. Article 4, Section 2's comity clause, again, seeks to promote national unity. And again, the point behind that is to ensure that if you have a privilege and immunity, you're not allowed to deny that treatment in other states. And again, it creates sort of a baseline of citizenship that says, Alaska, if you're going to, establish a subsidy for everybody that works on the pipelines, you can't give preferences to your citizens in terms of seeking those kinds of benefits. They have to be available to everybody. So that's it for this presentation. When we come back, we will continue our discussion of federalism, and hopefully, again, if any questions arise from my presentations, please feel free to ask me in the message board or anything like that, and I'm happy to try and clear it up for you. I'll see you next time.